Okay, so chapter 1 is an introduction to this A&P course, and we're going to continue on our chapter 1 discussion and continue with homeostasis. And homeostasis is just this maintenance of a constant internal environment despite any fluctuations in temperature. And I think this is kind of where we ended. I'm hoping so. I teach the same thing in other classes, so I get confused sometimes. But variables are measures of body properties that may change in value. So these variables could be blood glucose levels. They will rise after you eat. They could be temperature of your body, hormone levels. Your body tries to maintain this consistency of normal values of these different variables. Okay. These are examples of some of the variables seen there. The normal range is the normal extent of increase or decrease around a set point. So many of these variables in your body, like blood glucose, protein levels, other sort of substances that you can measure in your blood have a normal range of values. And that's something that doctors will check when you guys get your blood drawn. They'll make sure that all your blood type and everything within your blood is falling within a normal range. The set point is the normal or average value of a variable. And over time, the temperature, or an example of this is temperature, will fluctuate around that set point. So this is a graph showing normal range of body temperature, which really probably applies to all of us, 98.4 to 98.8. The set point, though, is 98.6 Fahrenheit. In Celsius, that's 37 degrees. So this would be the range, and then the set point is the average. So again, homeostasis tries to maintain this consistency within a range of normal variables, whether that's temperature, blood glucose level, things like that. There's a lot of different physiological processes that your bodies do to try to maintain that range of values. Set points for some of these variables can be temporarily adjusted depending on body activities. So body temperature, a common cause of change for that could be fever, and that's because that's your body's way of trying to get rid of whatever bad thing is in you and to try to start an immune response. So your body will raise in temperature to try to kill off whatever bacteria or virus could be in your body. So that's what fever does. Also, exercise will raise your body temperature, and that's okay, as long as it's still within that normal range of values. So your heart rate, your blood pressure, and your respiratory rate will increase with exercise. Negative feedback, I'm just going to take a look at the chat here. No questions, just all attendance. So thanks for writing here and your name and the section number. Negative feedback then is the main mechanism used to regulate homeostasis. And negative feedback does a change in the opposite direction. So a negative feedback response involves detection of a change in that variable. So any deviation away from that set point, whether it's a blood glucose level out of the range or if it's a temperature out of the range. And then the correction part of the negative feedback response will reverse that deviation to try to get it back to the normal set point. The components of a feedback loop, we sometimes call it because it'll eventually kind of goes in a circle, is the receptor that detects the changes in the variable. In temperature, the receptor is usually skin receptors in your skin that will detect temperature changes. Then it'll send that change to the control center, which is usually in your brain. It'll receive that receptor signal, then your brain will establish the set point and send some sort of signal to an effector to try to directly cause change in that variable. So your brain might send out a response to your skeletal muscles to start shivering or moving to raise your temperature if you're too cold. So this is called kind of a homeostasis negative feedback loop. And it begins with receptors in the skin, if we're talking about temperature. It sends that to the control center in the brain. The brain integrates that response or integrates that signal and figures out what kind of response then to send out. In this case, it's sending out a response to your sweat glands to initiate sweating to try to release or dissipate some of the heat. So this is a negative feedback system because once your body temperature goes back to its normal set point, it'll tell your brain to completely shut off and say, we're good, you don't need to do anything else now that Yes, I'll go back to the last page, Melina. Is this the page, Melina? Okay. All right, other questions so far? Have any of you guys heard or talked about homeostasis before in a bio class? Maybe you've heard about this a little bit. Okay. Yes. Yes. These all these PowerPoints are under files in Canvas. And after we finish chapter 1, I'll kind of take you through Canvas and show you where they are. Okay. So here's the homeostasis negative feedback loop. Here's negative feedback control of body temperature. So this is a little bit more in detail what happens to body temperature and how your body tries to maintain consistency in body temperature. So if we start with this graph by the number 1, the normal range of body temperature is within these darker blue lines. And if the normal range goes too high, homeostasis will be disturbed. It'll send out a signal to your brain that'll tell your effectors, your sweat glands, to produce heat to try to dissipate or release some of that heat if your body is too hot. It'll also dilate your blood vessels. And dilating your blood vessels when your body is too hot just tries to spread out the blood more. So it tries to spread out the heat to try to dissipate it to cool your body down. Then hopefully doing one of those two responses will lower your body temperature and bring it back within those range values. If we go in the opposite direction, if homeostasis is disturbed, if the temperature falls below that normal range, again, the stimulus will be detected by receptors in your brain that'll send out a response to effectors. It'll stop sweat production. It'll start muscle contraction, so that's the shivering. So it'll try to cause you to shiver because when your muscles shiver, the movement creates heat. Your blood vessels will also constrict, and your blood vessels will constrict to try to keep the heat in the center of your body. So this is why in cold temperatures, I'm from Minnesota, so this would happen all the time, but in cold temperatures, your fingers might look blue because your body's blood vessels are constricting, so not as much blood is getting out to your fingers, your toes. So that's in normal, like frostbite situations, people might lose their fingers or toes first because their body is trying to maintain heat by the vital organs, your heart, your liver, because you want the heat centrally located. So that's maintenance of body temperature. Positive feedback mechanisms will occur when the initial stimulus further stimulates the same response. So negative feedback reverses the change to try to get back to normal. Positive feedback reinforces the initial stimulus. And I'll give you an example of what a positive feedback mechanism might be. Normally within your body system's homeostasis, we talk about negative feedback, but positive feedback, the system response causes progressive deviation away from the set point. It's not really directly used for homeostasis. It'll occur under normal conditions, and a great one is childbirth. So if any of you have given birth to a kid before, or if you've seen someone given birth, the contractions will start and they won't stop. So levels of oxytocin will continue the contractions as positive feedback, and they won't stop until the birth of the child. So that's an example of positive feedback. Same as when you're hot, you turn red. Yep, Vanessa. Yeah, so when you're hot, you also turn red because your blood vessels are dilating. So blood is being kind of sent everywhere in your body. So you'll turn red. Yep. Positive feedback is also associated with injury or disease. So if, let's say you get cut, a positive feedback mechanism would send platelets and blood clots to the level of injury to try to stop the bleeding. So that would be an example of positive feedback. They would continue to send more and more platelets, more and more clotting to try to stop that place of injury. Negative feedback mechanisms are unable to maintain homeostasis completely. It can be kind of a balance of both. Here's a comparison of negative feedback and positive feedback. If we look at enzymes, so if you take a substrate, so I don't know if you guys have had chemistry yet, but these two graphs are just looking at a beginning product of the chemical equation, and they're taking you through to the active end product. And in negative feedback, once sufficient product is produced, it'll tell or turn off this enzyme. And enzymes are little proteins that help chemical equations from occurring. So if this negative feedback will have a negative feedback mechanism on an enzyme, and it'll deactivate that enzyme, which will stop this process from occurring when significant or there's enough product being produced. Positive feedback in the opposite way will encourage this enzyme to keep working, to keep turning substrate into active product. Okay, so then we'll kind of move on to terminology in the body plane. This is really what we did in lab and what we'll do in lab today if you haven't had lab yet. So I think the rest of this PowerPoint will be really helpful for lab. So if you've had lab already, this will be a good review. This is important for anatomy and physiology to understand what anatomical position is. And this is because you'll be referring to your patients in normal anatomical position, and you'll be referring to structures externally or internally based on where they're located on the body. We use different directional terminology, and these directional terminologies are listed here, and it's always based on the person standing erect or straight up with their palms and face facing forwards. All the relational descriptions are based on anatomical position, regardless of body orientation. So if this woman were face down, if she was lying in a bed, if she was upside down, all these directional terminologies would apply the same according to her anatomical position. So simply put, let's start with her right and left side of the body. Pay attention here. Students always get this mixed up. When we talk about someone's right arm, it's their right arm. So the right arm on that person themselves. The person's left side of the body is on their left side of the body. This is important when we talk about the heart anatomical features, because the heart has 4 chambers, and there's the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, and the left ventricle. And it's always rights and lefts for how it would be in your patient. So always think about directional terminology for how it would be in your patient. Then proximal and distal, these are directional terminologies describing an external or internal feature with how close it is in proximity to the point of attachment. And that's really the trunk of the body, which is the central region. So if a structure is more proximally located, it'll be closer to the trunk. And if it's distally located, it'll be further away. So in this anatomical position person, I would say her fingers are distal to her elbow because her fingers are further away from the point of attachment where her arm meets her trunk. I would say her shoulder is proximal to her fingers because her shoulder is closer to the point of attachment to her trunk. Proximal and distal we can use in her leg appendages as well. So I would say her knees are proximal to her ankles, or her ankles are distal to her knees. So pay attention to that and make sure you understand being able to describe structures that way. There's also directional terminology in comparison to the midline of a person. So a midline goes right down the center of your body, and any structures closer to that midline, we say they are medially located, and structures further away from the midline are laterally located. So in this person, her shoulders are lateral to her belly button because her shoulders are further away from her midline. Her belly button, her umbilicus, is medial to her hips or her ilium bones. That's the bone in your hip. What else? Her eyes are lateral to her nose because they're further away. Her ears are lateral to her nose, and her nose is medial to her ears. So that's using medial and lateral. And then superior and inferior use the same way just to describe structures. that are superiorly located towards the top and inferiorly located towards the bottom. You can see how superior and inferior could also be used to describe same structures as proximal and distal. So knees and toes, we could say the knees are superior to the toes, but we could also say the knees are proximal to the toes. So sometimes there's more than one directional terminology that you could use. Confused, or did that kind of make sense? Good, okay. I saw one thumbs up. I can only see a couple of you guys on the screen. So shoot me a chat message. If we'll kind of keep going through this in lab as well. Superior and inferior, anterior and posterior. This one that is kind of tricky sometimes because anterior also means ventral, and posterior, really the medically correct term for posterior is dorsal. So you'll probably hear dorsal and ventral more often when you read a patient's chart versus anterior and posterior. Cephalec has to do with closer to the head, and caudal means closer to the tail. So that's superior and inferior terms too. More directional terms and just more of like probably a good description of them. So medial and lateral have to do with the midline, proximal and distal. When it talks about close or far from the point of attachment, that means an attachment between an appendage, which is an arm or leg, and the trunk. So closer or far from the trunk or the center part of the body. And then superficial and deep are also really important, especially when we talk about skin structures, or if we were dissecting for real and face-to-face environment, superficial structures are closer to the surface and deeper structures are toward the interior of the body. So your skin is superficial to your bones because your skin is these surface structure. Your stomach organ is deep to, it's deep to the liver, it's right behind the liver. Your intestines are deep to your belly button. I always use the belly button, that seems like a good example to me. So more directional terms, and again, just directional arrows showing examples of each. And if you're confused on this, go back and work on your lab examples and the lab exercises in the virtual lab. And if you haven't had lab, this is what we're talking about today. So hopefully by the end of today, you'll feel better about it. Body planes, this brings up sagittal and median plane are both listed here, which are kind of the same, but there's basically 3 body planes. And body planes are important. This is how we slice the body. You're probably thinking, why is this important to know? Well, when you get an MRI done, they look at different slices taken through the body of that imaging. So an MRI, you're put into this really claustrophobic tube, and usually it's important to detect tumors or ligaments that have broken. I'm thinking of knees, but really it gives you a view of everything inside the body. And when you take the body image that an MRI gives you, you can slice that image into different planes to determine what you're looking at and to help you with diagnosing the problem. A sagittal plane separates the body into right and left parts. So that would be going right down the center of me. That would be the sagittal plane. And so the sagittal plane would be any separation of the body into right and left parts. The median plane is the sagittal plane right along the midline that divides the body into equal left and right halves. So that's the difference between a sagittal and a medial plane. A sagittal plane could be a cut down me over here that would go down the body, but it wouldn't be equal right and left halves. A median plane is an equal cut to cut me down the body into equal right and left halves. The transverse plane is a horizontal plane that separates the body into superior or inferior parts. And usually, not always in an MRI, they take transverse planes because you get a good look, a transverse look going through a lot of your organs that are vertical, if that makes sense. So your kidneys are vertical. If you take a transverse cut through them, you'll be able to open up a kidney and see it. The median plane is the same as the mid-sagittal plane. Yes, because the median plane would, well, let me get back to you on that because I've actually never seen them separated out like this. And in lab, we're just calling it the mid-sagittal plane. Mid-sagittal would be the same as median, David, because mid-sagittal is describing a sagittal plane in the midline. So yes, I would call them the same. And then if you just are talking about a sagittal plane, that could be any spot on the right or the left side of the body. That's a great question, David. And then a frontal plane is a vertical plane that separates the body into an anterior and a posterior part. So if you look at the side of this guy, it's dividing his front half from his back half. When we talk about sutures in the skull, you'll see that there's a suture, or there's a suture called the coronal suture, and that's just another word for frontal plane. Okay, so those are body planes. This is a look at body planes and what kind of cut you would get, whether it would be a cadaver or an MRI structure. So this is a sagittal section of the head because it's cut down the head into a half where you can open it up and see a sagittal section. So you're looking at a sagittal section of the head there. Here you're looking at a transverse section through the abdomen. And again, because a lot of your organs are vertical, when you cut through them transversely, you can kind of see a lot of the structures in them that way. So this is showing the stomach, the large intestine, the spleen. It's really hard to see this, but this is a transverse section. And then here is a frontal section. I think this one is showing through the right hip. So it's showing the femur, the coxal bone where it connects to the hip bone, some of your muscles. So again, it's important to learn the body planes because you guys will most definitely be looking at cuts of body in some sort of clinical section, and then to be able to determine what organs you'd be looking at through that cut. Lots of things to look forward to in your professions. So this is a great look, again, just showing a longitudinal section, but how it would look different as you would go down. So these are, well, this is a longitudinal section. So it would look like this. And if we were to take a section out of the intestine like this, it would be more circularly shaped. Oops. So it's important this is why taking these sections and understanding the terminology is important because you can get a different view of the organ as you're looking at them. Body regions, you have upper limbs, lower limbs, and then the central region. So your upper limbs are your arms, forearms, wrist, and hands. Your lower limbs are the thigh, lower leg, ankle, and foot. And then the central region is your head, neck, and trunk. So we kind of define those really broad body regions as upper, lower limbs, and then the central region. The body parts and regions in a little more detail, and again, we go over this in lab, are described here. So the frontal region has to do with your forehead, orbital, your eye, cervical, neck, pectoral, chest. Sternal is the breastbone or breastplate. Abdominal, umbilical, pelvic, inguinal, pubic. So it takes you through more detailed descriptions of body regions. And it's really great to just study this chart a little bit because through the rest of your A&P careers, if you go on to take anatomy and physiology separately or together or whatever, you'll learn all the muscles, nerves, and structures. And a lot of the muscles, nerves, structures, blood vessels are all, some of them are named for what region of the body they're in. So you guys have an axillary artery and it's in the axillary region of the body. You'll have cervical arteries in the neck region. You have pectoralis major and pectoralis minor muscles are in your chest. You have inguinal ligaments and inguinal canals in your groin area. Digits, palmar, carpal bones are the bones in your wrist. So just knowing the general kind of name of each of these body regions is very important because it really comes back to haunt you in anatomy especially. Learning anatomy especially is like learning a new language. And if you can learn what each of these regions mean, then learning the structures and the muscles associated with them, it'll just be a lot easier to remember where they are. So look at the back. The vertebral region will be by the spinal column. So you'll have vertebral muscles. You'll have vertebral nerves and arteries. Lumbar is the lower half of that vertebral region. The sacral region, gluteal, perineal, popliteal or popliteal is your hollow space behind the knee. The plantar region is the sole of your foot. So you might have heard of plantar fasciitis is a disorder with the plantar region of your foot, with some of the ligaments there. The calcaneal region, that's your calcaneus is your heel bone, and the Achilles tendon is also called your calcaneal tendon. So a lot of these regions, again, will be important for naming the structures within them. The scapular region is your shoulder blade, so you'll have scapular arteries, nerves, blood vessels. The acromial region, the olecranon is the fancy word for your elbow. So olecranon is your elbow. Dorsum is the back of your hand. Remember, dorsal means back. So we call the dorsal the back, the dorsum the back of the hand. Okay, some subdivisions of the abdomen. Again, this is a great review of lab. This is really just all we're doing in lab today too. So these are subdivisions of the abdomen, just kind of general right and left subdivisions, whether it's an upper quadrant or a lower quadrant. And again, you'll notice the rights and lefts are on this person's body. So it's not how you're looking at the person. The right upper quadrant is how it would be on you or how it would be on a patient. So dividing the abdomen into quadrants or regions is important for surgical terms. It's important for diagnosing pain. If someone comes into the ER and complains of extreme pain in the right iliac region or right lower quadrant region, you might wonder if there's appendicitis, a problem with the appendix, which is right there. Right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, and left lower quadrant. And then we divide them into 9 more detailed regions here. Hypochondriac, epigastric, right and left, the right lumbar, left lumbar, the umbilical region would be where your belly button is, and then the iliac region corresponds to the right and left side, and also to the iliac region that was on the previous slide for body regions. Hypogastric, so gastric has to do with your stomach, and the prefix epi means above, so epigastric literally means above the stomach, and your stomach is right here where my cursor is. So this would be a region kind of, well, in this case, it's kind of where the stomach is, but above the stomach. And hypogastric, the prefix hypo means below or less. Okay, then we I think the rest of this PowerPoint is body cavities. And I might try to go ahead and finish this chapter 1 PowerPoint just because this is really what we're doing in lab, even though we'll still have Tuesday to get through it. So within your body, your organs are within cavities, or kind of defined bags, I guess you could say. They're in kind of cavities within your body, and each organ is within a specific cavity. And this is important so that your organs aren't just like running into each other. Everything is in its appropriate spot. The thoracic cavity is the space within the chest wall and the diaphragm. So your thoracic cavity is all up here where my cursor is. It contains your heart, the lungs, the thymus gland, your esophagus, and trachea. So here's your thoracic cavity. The mediastinum is located within the thoracic cavity, and it's right here. It's the space between the lungs. So the mediastinum will contain your heart, the thymus gland, which is right here. Your esophagus and trachea are these structures, and then it'll also contain some major blood vessels that come off of the heart. In green, these little green circles are thymus glands that are important for thymus glands or lymphatic glands, which are important for the lymphatic system. So the mediastinum is this central part within the thoracic cavity. The abdominal cavity is this entire area, or collectively it's called the abdominal pelvic cavity. And then we divide it into the abdominal cavity and then the pelvic cavity is the 2 separation points. But the abdominal cavity is the space between the diaphragm and the pelvis. So it's located right below the diaphragm where my cursor is. This is where your stomach, intestines, liver, spleen, pancreas, and kidneys are. And then the pelvic cavity is the space within the pelvis. It will contain all of your reproductive organs, your urinary bladder, and a part of the large intestine, the rectum, the part that takes waste out of the body. There's what we call serous membranes that line these cavities and cover the organs. And we're going to talk about serous membranes and think about them as if you were to put your fist through a balloon. And if your fist is an organ, The serous cavity is made up of two different membranes, which are just linings or coverings, and then the cavity between those membranes. So if your fist is the organ and you've pushed it through a balloon, the inner kind of balloon wall is what we call the visceral serous membrane, and that's the part that will cover the organ. So your heart, for example, has a visceral membrane that covers your heart itself. And then there's an outer membrane. This is called the parietal serous membrane. This usually covers or lines the inside of the body cavity itself. And then there'll be a space between these two serous membranes. And this space can sometimes be filled with fluid when it's surrounding organs to help with protection, or with friction if the organ were to be moving, or it could be filled with air. So your lungs have this cavity around them and your heart also does. So these are serous membranes. There's 3 sets of serous membranes and cavities. The pericardium around the heart, and we call the cavity the pericardial cavity. The pleura around the lungs, and we call the cavity or space between the membranes the pleural cavity. And the peritoneum is around all of the abdominal pelvic organs, and we call the cavity or the space the peritoneal cavity. And I'll take you through pictures of what this means. So what this just means is, picture that your heart is, again, your fist being pushed into a balloon. And when you push your fist into a balloon, remember you'll have 2 sides of the balloon wall sticking out with a space or air filled between them. So the visceral pericardium is the innermost wall that covers the heart itself. The parietal pericardium is thicker, but it'll cover the outer kind of layer of that pericardium. And then you'll have the pericardial cavity in between. It'll contain fluid that helps to reduce friction as the heart is rubbing up against your lungs or other structures in that cavity. So these are what pericardial cavity is. Whenever you see the word cardia, that has to do with the heart. So these are it's called the pericardium. So they're just the layers that surround your heart. Pleura and pleural always has to do with lungs. So keep that in mind. You might have heard of pneumonia, any like P words. I'm trying to think of other examples, but pleura and pleural cavity have to do with your lungs. So again, the lungs are covered by what we call the visceral pleura, which covers the lungs. And then the parietal pleura lines the inside wall of the thoracic cavity itself. And between those 2 layers, you have this cavity again, and that cavity contains pleural fluid that also helps to reduce friction. So if your lungs are kind of moving around a little bit, this pleural fluid just provides a level of protection to the lungs and also helps to reduce friction as they're moving around. It also adheres lungs to the thoracic wall. And you can see how the diaphragm is located right below the lungs to separate out the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity below it. The peritoneum is a little more complex, but it's the same idea. You have a visceral peritoneum, which is just a layer that covers all of your organs and anchors the organs. There's double layers called mesenteries that really are involved with your small and large intestine. And the mesenteries just help blood vessels and nerves to travel through them to give blood supply and nervous supply to your intestines. And then the peritoneal cavity itself, whoops, must have been the last slide, reduces friction. So again, the peritoneal cavity will just be space between the 2 just to help reduce friction. So again, your organs in your abdominal cavity aren't just bumping into each other. You have these layers that are surrounding your organs and then lining the wall of the cavity itself to keep the organs anchored in their place and to reduce friction when they move around from each other. Okay, so I knew this wasn't going to take that long, but let me bring us back here. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to answer any questions, and I'm going to show you guys where you can find these on Canvas again. So the only assignment, so in terms of assignments, the only assignments you guys have are to read the chapters, And then you'll have lab assignments that you'll do during lab time. Yep, no problem. So let's go ahead. We're going to be probably done early with lecture today, and if everyone is here in lab, we can start lab early, but I just want to share my screen with Canvas one more time to show you guys where this is located. So files are located here, and these are all the lecture PowerPoints that we'll go over. We've gotten through the chapter 1 lecture, and we'll probably start chapter 2 on Tuesday. So, and then your lab PowerPoints are all seen here as well. For lab this week, we're getting through the first 2 exercises. Let's see, I think, did I give an announcement here? I gave you an announcement, a link to the lecture YouTube channel link, which I will record all lectures and put them there, and the lab lecture YouTube link. The lab lecture YouTube link is probably just going to include the lecture from my Tuesday lab because they'll be the same. A couple more questions. My book got delayed and won't arrive. I don't know if there's anywhere where you can read chapter 1. I'm not testing you on it or giving points for reading the chapter. So if you can't read chapter 1 until then, I would just study the PowerPoint for now and do the exercises in the virtual lab for help. So I'm not really grading you on that. It's just an encouragement. If you guys are still with me, this is the virtual lab that you all have access to. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this into the chat right now. This virtual lab is always open for you, and it takes you through lab exercises that you can work on in lab or in general just to help practice some of these directional terminologies and body regions. So you'll enter in right here, and then you'll go through the first couple exercises, and this takes you through a review of systems and the microscope and the cell, and that's also a good review for what we did. Yes, your only assignments are the lab activities and lab exams and lecture exams. Yep, that'll be how it is for the whole semester. Really simple put. You only get points for your lab activities from lab, so you have to come to lab to get that link. And yes, how will you get your grades? Every weekend, I will try to update Canvas for your grades. So in Canvas, right here in grades, you should see your grades given to you for those lab activities. There's nothing listed there yet. I haven't done that. Where will the lab quizzes? There will be no lab quizzes, just lab exams, and those will be done through Google. So if you haven't had me in lab yet, if you have, you'll see how you take your lab activity questions, and your lab exams will all be given through Google Drive, as well as your lecture exams, all through Google Drive. Thoracic cavity is right above the diaphragm. So your thoracic cavity is, oops, sorry about that. This is probably the best picture I have. Let me make sure you guys are seeing this. Can you guys see the body cavities picture? Hopefully. Okay, so this is, the diaphragm is in pink right here, and it separates out your thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity below it. Yes, you're welcome. Anyone else? Thanks for helping answer each other's questions in the chat. I appreciate that. There will be 60 to 70 of us on here if everyone shows up, so I appreciate helping answering other questions. The diaphragm is not a cavity itself. No, the diaphragm is a muscle. And during the polio epidemic, the polio paralyzed your diaphragm, so it was not allowing these people to breathe. So that's why everyone in those days who got polio had to be put in an iron lung machine to help them breathe, which was doing the work of their diaphragm. The diaphragm itself is a muscle. It's not a cavity. It's not within a cavity. They call it kind of the division between the two cavities. For lab, are we able to finish the labs then leave, or do we have to finish? Yeah, so once we do, lab will always probably be short. So I'm gonna do a quick introduction for lab. which now that we've been through chapter 1, it'll probably be even quicker because it's basically what we've done. And then I'll give you the activity link that'll take you to the Google Drive exercises. And then you guys, I don't watch you do the activities, but I give you until 4 p.m. to do the activities. But then I will turn the activities off, so I won't accept answers after a certain time. That'll make more sense when we get to lab today. For those of you who have had lab, do you have any questions? It'll be a lot clearer when we have lab. No, if you attended lab on Tuesday, you don't have to attend today's lab. So you guys are all in the same lecture, but you have labs on different days. If you're section 35, you go on Tuesdays. And if you're section 36, you have lab on Thursdays. So you don't have to go both days. You can if you want to. I'll be there, but you don't have to. You can't touch up the 2 you submitted again. I won't take any more options. Yeah, so you can't resubmit any of the lab activities. And if you miss that time, you just have to forfeit those points. So some of you say you're gonna miss lab some days. And if you miss lab those days, it doesn't really bother me. You just have to forfeit those 5 points for that activity. On Tuesday of next week, we're gonna start chapter 2. Yes, okay, for lab, you'll submit them with your email address. And you have to use your school email address. Some of you guys didn't, and that's okay. But technically for FERPA regulations, we just want you to use your school issued email address. Until you get that or can have access to that, you can use a different email address, but please use your school email address. Assignments for today will just be lab assignments that you'll have if you have me today for lab, but otherwise, if you already have lab, there's no other assignments. The only assignments you have to do are the reading, lab activities when you have lab, and when we have exams. You guys are free to go whenever, but I'll stay on and answer questions. For those of you who have me in lab today, I'm assuming you're all here. I just want to make sure. I'm a little nervous to start lab early because I don't know if everyone's here. Do you guys want to start lab early? Yes, I know you guys do. I do too. How many questions do you think is in the chapter? Oh, yeah, that's what I was going to tell you guys, everyone. For all the exams, they're all worth 100 points. Well, the lecture exams are 100 points. The lab exams, I think, are 50 or 25, 50 points. And you don't have 100 questions because someone was asking, you only have an hour to do the lecture exams. And they're not 100 questions. So just keep that in mind. They're just 100 points. When's our first exam coming up? I'll take you to the syllabus. So here is your syllabus that hopefully you guys can see in front of me. So our first, it looks like lecture and labs exams will be the week of September 8th and 10th. So lab exams are worth 50 points, lecture exams are worth 100. I've looked through them. There are not 100 points or 100 questions because you only have an hour to do lecture and 30 minutes to do lab. You guys were all saying yes for something. What was that? The lab virtual, that is the doors. It's only for our benefit. No, you don't have to turn it in. So this virtual lab, it's really helpful. It basically, where is it again? Where's my Google Chrome? There we go. The virtual lab is just really helpful. The virtual lab is just the lab book itself. If you guys were doing it in person and writing in all the answers, this guy, the department chair has created all of these exercises for you to do online. And they're basically just that PDF version of your lab manual online. So they're only for your benefit. 100 questions, or no, not 100 questions for the chapter exam, but 100 points. Just reading through the chat. Starting lab now sounds good. We'll start lab soon. I see. Thank you for saying yes. All right. Can you guys just give me like 10 minutes? How about we start at 12:30 and we'll work on lab. It'll be a quick and easy lab because a lot of this stuff will be a review, but I'll see you guys in about 10 minutes if you have lab. Okay? Any other questions? See you next week. Thanks, guys. Thanks for a great first week. I appreciate all of your participation and effort. For lab, just a reminder, you have to click on a different Zoom lab link, okay? So we'll start a new Zoom for lab. All right, guys, we'll see you at 12:30. I'll go ahead and end this.